This is the first video of the module Parts of Speech and Grammar Basics. Let me first say that the information in this module is very basic, it's very introductory. If you're someone who has an extraordinary command of language, you understand grammar very well, it may well be that many of the videos in this module you won't need to watch. You'll find them too basic. This module is designed primarily for people either who haven't thought much about grammar and need to learn all the basics from scratch, or for people who are learning English as a second language. And of course, those folks probably have learned all these grammar terms, but it's good to see how they're all interrelated and how they're used in context. So just be forewarned, the videos, especially this video, start at a very basic level. So, starting at square one, every word in a sentence has what we call a part of speech. Noun, verb, adjective, adverb, these are parts of speech. In other words, these are the roles that the words play in the sentence. In order to understand grammar, it's absolutely essential to understand the role that each word is playing. Now, relatedly, there are these terms either to parse a sentence or to diagram a sentence, and this means to label the grammatical role of each word in the sentence, to identify the part of speech. So, for example, we have a sentence here, wonderful sentence from Shakespeare, I have come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. So, for example, if we were going to parse this, we might say, okay, we have a pronoun here. We have the main verb, so the pronoun is the subject, and then this is the main verb of the sentence. Then what we have is an infinitive. In fact, this is what's called an infinitive of purpose. We'll talk about this later. This infinitive has a direct object, which is another noun. And then we have not, which is an adverb, but it's playing the role of a conjunction here. It's joining two things. I've come to bury Caesar, not. And then we have another infinitive of purpose in parallel, and then a pronoun direct object. And so those are the roles that things are playing in that sentence. Now, of course, the sentence correction is not going to ask you to diagram a sentence, but to understand the sophisticated levels of grammar that are going on in a sentence correction sentence, you need to be able to identify the role of each word. The role of nouns. So first of all, a noun itself is any person, place, thing, activity, idea, or relationship. It's a very broad category. If you're ever unclear, you can just look up a word in the dictionary and it will tell you whether it's a noun or not. One way to think about a noun is that a noun can be anything that can be the subject of a sentence. So we can say a person is happy, we could say democracy is working, the disease is running its course, something like this. So all of these can be subjects of the sentence, so these are nouns. There's a star here, of course, because the subject of a sentence doesn't have to be a noun. It could be something taking the place of a noun. For example, a pronoun. We'll talk about pronouns much more in depth in a later module, but just I'll mention right now either a noun or a pronoun could be the subject. So, noun can be the subject of a sentence. When it is a subject, it's in something called subjective form. Now, in other languages, this is really a big deal. Whether a noun is the subject or an object, there's an actual different ending on the word or a different form for the word. This is not at all the case in English. It only matters for pronouns. So pronouns, if they're subjects of the sentence and the pronouns are in what's called subjective form, I, he, she, they, we, these are the forms that the pronoun would take to be the subject of a sentence. Now, of course, a noun or a pronoun can also be an object. What are the kinds of objects? Well, first of all, it can be a direct object. Whenever you buy something, sell something, borrow something, steal something, etc., these are direct objects. The action of the verb is acting on this object. So a full verb can have a direct object, and what really makes things interesting is that all the verb forms, infinitives, participles, gerunds, we'll talk about all these in the unit on verb form, but every one of these can have a direct object as well. In addition to direct objects, there are also indirect objects. Typically, this is a person receiving the action. So, for example, somebody bakes me a cake. So, the cake is the actual direct object, and I, the person, I'm receiving that direct object. Indirect objects are common in colloquial speech, they're common in ordinary language. They're not all that common in academic writing and in the writing you'll see on the GMAT. It's very rare that you'll see an indirect object on a GMAT question. Finally, it can be an object of a preposition. Here are some prepositions. There's a later video in this module where I'll talk in depth about prepositions and prepositional phrases. I'll just mention here, this is another example of a noun being an object. Finally, nouns can be in the possessive. And this is kind of a curveball. This is interesting. So for example, if I have a sentence like Mike's walrus can roller skate, well, the word Mike, that's a proper noun, so that's a name. But because it's in the possessive, it's acting like a modifier. It's modifying the walrus, which is, in fact, the subject of the sentence. And so, in a way, it's not really in a noun role anymore. So this might not seem like a very important issue at the moment. This has extraordinary implications, as we'll see later on, both when we talk about pronouns and issues of agreement, and when we talk about modifiers and logic problems in sentences. I'll just point out right now that when it's in the possessive, it's not really acting like a noun anymore. This is an introduction to the idea of verbs. So the first thing I'll say is that a verb is the most important word in a sentence, in the sense that you can't have a complete sentence without a verb. Every complete sentence needs at least one verb. And in an extreme case, it's possible to have a complete sentence that is composed entirely of one word, one verb. This would be a verb in the imperative. For example, listen. That would be an example of a command, a verb in the imperative, and that single word forms a complete sentence. Another way to say it is that verbs are action words. Verbs are the words that really tell the story and move along the story that is contained within each sentence. There are two broad categories of verbs, transitive verbs and intransitive verbs. Transitive verbs are verbs that do some action to something. These are verbs that take a direct object. So for example, you can buy something, you can steal something, you can help someone, you can determine something, you can establish something. These are transitive verbs. They take a direct object. By contrast, intransitive verbs, we could describe these either as actions without an object, to laugh, to walk, to live, or we could describe these as states of being, to be, to wane, to prosper. Now here we could really split hairs. We could say to prosper, is that a state of being? Is that an action without an object? It doesn't really matter for our purpose. All of these are intransitive verbs. All of these are verbs that do not take a direct object. Finally, I'll just mention verbs have other forms, infinitive, gerunds, participles. We'll talk about these in depth when we talk about verb forms in the next module. Verbs also have a number of properties, the tense, the number, the mood, the voice. All of this we'll explore in the section on verb forms. Adjectives. Adjectives describe nouns. Adjectives answer the question, which noun or what kind of noun. So for example, the red bird tells us what kind of bird or which bird. The expensive house tells us what kind of house or which house, and so forth with all these adjectives. Adjectives may follow a form of the verb to be, and this is called a predicate adjective. So for example, the sky is blue. The reason is clear. These are adjectives following a form of the verb to be. The postponement is due to rain. Very important to appreciate that the word due is in fact an ordinary adjective. And this will have enormous implications later on in the diction videos, what we can do with the word due and what we can't do with the word due because it's an adjective. Adjectives may also follow verb plus object for certain verbs. So things like, she will paint the room white. He makes the teacher mad. So this is actually a totally correct, valid grammatical form. You are not likely to see this on the GMAT sentence correction. But just so you know, this is perfectly correct. It is much more common in colloquial speech. The role of an adjective may be played by a group of words, a phrase, or a clause. This is called an adjectival phrase or an adjectival clause. So this would be a group of words that is modifying a noun. Incidentally, I'll just point out here, we'll discuss in much greater detail in later videos what a phrase is, what a clause is, the differences in these. Right now, it's just sufficient to know that a phrase and a clause, these are both just these are both terms for a group of words. A clause is a group of words that has a verb inside of it. A phrase is a group of words that doesn't have a verb inside of it. That's all you need to know at this point. So examples of adjectival phrases, and these are various groups of words that act as adjectives. That is to say, they're describing the noun or they're modifying the noun. These are examples of adjectival clauses. So notice that there's a noun and a verb. You always have a noun and a verb in a clause. These are groups of words that are also just modifying the noun. And again, some of them can be very short, and some of them, especially the clauses, can get very, very long. And of course, it's probably not a surprise to you, on the GMAT sentence correction, you're going to see some very long clauses. So for summary, any phrase or clause on the GMAT sentence correction, it's always important to determine what role does this group of words play. An adjectival phrase or clause modifies a noun as an adjective would. So it's very important always to know exactly what role each phrase or clause is playing in a sentence. This video introduces the idea of adverbs and clauses and phrases that act like adverbs. So first of all, an adverb is a word that can modify a verb or an adjective or another adverb. Kind of a tricky category. Adverbs answer questions like how, why, where, when, in what manner. So for example, here are some adverbs. The adverb cheerfully describes the verb. How did she sing? In what manner did she sing? The adverb menacingly modifies advanced, describes how the monster advanced. The adverb unusually describes happy. How happy? Well, unusually happy. Meanwhile, the adverb today describes the verb, the action of the main sentence. When is this action taking place? The adverb frequently modifies the verb visits, describes the manner in which he visits, and the adverb quite is modifying another adverb. It's telling us how frequently. So very tricky. Adverbs, again, they can modify verbs, they can modify adjectives, or they can modify other adverbs. Now, many of the adverbs here have this ly ending. And in fact, you may be familiar with the rule. You can take any adjective, stick ly on the end, and you get an adverb. Some people labor under the misapprehension that all adverbs have ly at the end. So just to dispel this, here is a set of several adverbs that do not have the ly ending. You'll notice there's quite a variety of words that count as adverbs, but they do not have the ly ending. I'll just point out a couple other endings we have here. We have ward, and then we have these words ending in wise. It turns out that ward and wise are two suffixes we can put on nouns to get adverbs. So just a little interesting fact there. The role of an adverb may be played by a group of words, a phrase or a clause. This is called an adverbial phrase or an adverbial clause. Here are some examples of adverbial phrases. Some of these are titles. You'll notice we have a lot of prepositional phrases. We also have some participial phrases playing part of the role of an adverbial phrase. Here are some examples of adverbial clauses. Again, a clause has to have a noun and a verb. So clause, noun, nobody, spotted, verb. So happy that nobody spotted his mistake. It describes how happy he was. The second one is a rather long adverbial clause. It is actually a sentence from a poem by T.S. Eliot. Here we have a noun, the kingfisher's wing. Wing is the actual noun. We have a verb. We actually have a second verb in parallel, all inside the clause. And all of this describes the time of the main action of the sentence. Now you might think this is a long adverbial clause, but take a look at this one. This adverbial clause is the one that begins the United States Declaration of Independence. This is a gigantic adverbial clause. And so this just gives you a sense. Adverbial clauses can be very large. Now, they're probably not going to be quite as large as this, but they are going to be very large on GMAT sentence correction. So just be prepared for large clauses that are playing the role of adverbs. This video is about conjunctions, words that join things together. These are small, easy to underestimate words, but they're very important. The three types of conjunctions are coordinating conjunctions, correlative conjunctions, and subordinating conjunctions. Now, before I go on, let me remind you, these words here, these grammar terms, are not things you need to know for the GMAT. We'll be using these when we talk about the grammar, but once you learn the grammar, you don't need to know these terms. The GMAT's never going to ask you, is this a correlative conjunction? GMAT is just going to give you sentences, and you're going to have to figure out the grammar of those sentences. So we're using these terms only in the discussion of that grammar. So, coordinating conjunctions. Coordinating conjunctions are words that link things of equal rank. And there are three very common coordinating conjunctions that stand out as special: and, or, and but. What's special about these? Well, first of all, the words and or can join just about anything. They can join two nouns, two verbs, two adjectives, two adverbs, two phrases, or two clauses. So pretty much any two things that are grammatically the same thing, you can put and or between them. Here we have some examples. Bacon and eggs, two nouns. Stand and deliver, two verbs. Necessary and sufficient, two adjectives. Fight or flight, two nouns. Fish or cut bait, two verbs. Regular or low fat, two adjectives. Similarly, the word but can't join two nouns, but the word but can join verbs, adjectives, adverbs, phrases, or clauses. So it is also quite versatile as a conjunction. So argue but agree, two verbs. Strong but yielding, two adjectives. Quickly but mindfully, two adverbs. Bloodied but unbowed, those are actually two participles joined by the word but. These are the 7 coordinated conjunctions in English, and there's a wonderful mnemonic for remembering these: the word fanboys. If you remember fanboys, you can remember all 7 coordinated conjunctions. And these are the words that can join 2 independent clauses. So here are some examples. In each one of these sentences, we have 2 independent clauses joined by the conjunction. In other words, if we drop out the conjunction, we could make 2 separate complete sentences. We have hope in winter, period. Spring is near at hand, period. 2 complete sentences because those are 2 independent clauses. Here's a passage from Shakespeare in which he uses conjunctions, coordinated conjunctions, to link independent clauses. The second type, correlative conjunctions, pairs of words or phrases that put items in parallel. And so this is the list of all the important correlative conjunctions. These first 4 have the same kind of flexibility that we talked about with the others. In other words, you can use these to link 2 nouns, 2 verbs, 2 adjectives, 2 adverbs, basically 2 of anything, as long as they're the same thing. These last 2 are really used only for clauses. Now, these are particularly important to recognize because these are markers for parallelism. If you see these in the sentence, you know that there's going to be parallelism going on. We're going to talk about that much later in the module on parallelism. Finally, subordinating conjunctions. Subordinating conjunctions are words that introduce a dependent, that is to say, a subordinate clause. So we'll talk in detail in an upcoming video about the nature of a subordinate clause, but first it's just important to understand this idea of a subordinating conjunction. One very technical distinction I'll make here: subordinated conjunctions always introduce a dependent clause, but dependent clauses can be introduced by words other than subordinating conjunctions. This is something we'll explore more in the video on subordinate clauses. It turns out there's a wonderful mnemonic for remembering the subordinate conjunctions. On a white bus. Well, what do I mean by this? Well, here are the ones that represent on, a, white, bus. This is a list of the most important subordinating conjunctions in English. So finally, I'll just say, this is simply an introduction to the idea of conjunctions. This is just to wake you up and get you to pay attention to these particular words. Obviously, we have much more to say about these concepts. There's going to be more information in the lesson on clauses and in the lessons on parallelism. This video introduces the important idea of clauses. So first of all, big idea number one, every clause must have a subject and a full verb. See, a clause is like a sentence in miniature, and there may be many of these clauses inside a full complex sentence. The reason I emphasize full verb is to make the point that it's not enough to have a verb form, such as a participle or infinitive. That's not enough for a clause. A clause demands a full bona fide verb. These are distinctions we'll explore a little more in the series of videos on verb form. Big idea number two, there are two kinds of clauses, independent clauses and dependent clauses. An independent clause can stand on its own as a complete sentence. And in fact, any sentence that simply has one noun and one verb in it, that entire sentence is an independent clause. A dependent clause is a modifier. It cannot stand on its own as a complete sentence. It's playing the role of a modifier, modifying something about the independent clause of the sentence. So for example, this particular sentence, which is a Beatles song, when I cannot sing my heart, I can only speak my mind. The first word, when, is a subordinate conjunction. So that's telling us it's introducing a dependent clause, a subordinate clause. Within the subordinate clause, we have a subject, the pronoun, and we have a verb. So full subject and verb. Notice that this dependent clause, when I cannot speak my heart, when I cannot sing my heart, this cannot stand alone as a full sentence. It's only a modifier. Meanwhile, the independent clause, this is actually what could stand alone as a complete sentence without the modifier. And again, we have a subject and a verb. This subject and this verb are in fact the main subject and main verb of the whole sentence. And that leads us to big idea number three. Every sentence must have at least one independent clause. If it has that one independent clause, the subject of that clause is the main subject of the sentence. The verb of that clause is the main verb of the sentence. Now it's important to point out, every sentence must have at least one independent clause. Many of the sentences you'll see on the GMAT actually have 2, 3, even 4 different clauses. There are some very complex sentences on the GMAT. Every single one of them has to have at least one independent clause. In this video, we'll go into somewhat more depth on subordinate clauses. So, how would you recognize a subordinate clause in context? Well, every subordinate clause begins with a dependent word, and the dependent words fall into 2 broad categories. One are the subordinate conjunctions. We've met those before in a previous video. And the other are relative pronouns and adverbs or interrogative words. Now this very fancy sounding term, interrogative words, interrogative just means having to do with a question. Interrogative words are the words that could begin questions. Who, what, why, where, when. Those are interrogative words. So the general structure for a subordinate clause, if we have a subordinate conjunction other than the word that actually is exceptional. We'll talk about that in later videos. But for all other subordinate conjunctions, the general formula is this. We will have a noun and a verb. That's our main clause. Then we'll have the subordinate conjunction introducing the subordinate clause, and then a full noun and verb following the subordinate clause. So it actually is true that you could take the subordinate clause, remove the subordinate conjunction, and what's inside it would stand as a full sentence by itself. It would be a full noun plus verb structure. And of course, this subordinate clause can either come before or after the independent clause. So here's a very famous example sentence from Dean Martin. This is a long subordinate clause that comes before the independent clause. So we have a subordinate conjunction, we have a noun, we have a verb, and in fact this whole thing, we drop the when, This whole thing, the moon hits your eye like a big pizza pie, that could be a full sentence. That has a noun and a verb. But we put the word when in front of it, that makes it a subordinate clause. So we need an independent clause, and that's what we have here in blue, the independent clause. And in fact, the noun and the verb are contracted together in that single word, that's, which is a contraction for that is, noun and verb. So what about relative pronouns and interrogative words? Well, very fancy names of these categories. These words are relative pronouns. And these words are relative adverbs and interrogative words. Now, all of these are relative pronouns. Some of them are also interrogative words. In the second list, all are relative adverbs. Some are also interrogative words. The distinctions here do not matter. You do not need to worry about these individual distinctions. But I will say it's very important to recognize that any of these could begin a subordinate clause. And we're going to make an important distinction here. The relative adverbs and interrogative words act like subordinate conjunctions in the sense that you'll have one of these words, then a noun, and then a verb. So everything we just said about subordinate conjunctions is also true about the relative adverbs, about the second list. The first list is a little bit different. The relative pronouns are a little bit different. Here's why. Relative pronouns play a noun role inside the clause, and may be the subject of the clause or the direct object of the clause. So that's very interesting. In other words, you can't just drop that and have a full sentence anymore, because the relative pronoun, in addition to introducing the subordinate clause, could play an essential role in the clause. So, for example, I have a friend who met the Dalai Lama. So the relative pronoun who is the subject and met is the verb. And so here, it's the subject of the sentence. I want a bird that whistles. Again, that is the subject with a verb. Last one, very interesting. The subject is the police. The verb is accused. And here, whom is a direct object of the verb. And because it's an object, the pronoun appears in objective form. And that's why we use whom instead of who, because it's appearing as an object. So these are examples of relative pronouns playing noun roles in the subordinate clauses. This video explores the very sophisticated idea of substantive clauses. So, some subordinate clauses play the role of an adjective in the main sentence, and these we would call adjectival clauses. We've already met some examples of these. Some subordinate clauses play the role of an adverb in the main sentence. These we call adverbial clauses. We've met some of these. I would say of the subordinate clauses you see in GMAT sentence correction, at least 95% of them are either adjectival clauses or adverbial clauses. So what we're going to be talking about in this particular module is more of a special case. First thing I'll point out is that no subordinate clause can ever play the role of a verb in the main sentence. Verbs are pretty special. Things can play noun roles, things can play adjective or adverb roles. Nothing can play a verb role other than a verb. So that's important to appreciate. But certain subordinate clauses can play the role of a noun. And when this happens, we can call this a substantive clause. Some people call it a noun clause. Sometimes it's called a nominative relative clause. There are all kinds of fancy terms for this. The term I'll be using is substantive clause. A substantive clause is a subordinate clause that is acting in the role of a noun. A substantive clause begins with a relative pronoun or relative adverb or an interrogative word. So in other words, this second category of things, these clauses never begin with subordinate conjunctions. So this is very important to appreciate. A substantive clause can be the subject of a sentence. So for example, we have a couple example sentences here. Whoever wins the election will not change the current trends in the market. So this clause, whoever wins the election, that is the subject of the sentence, that whole clause. That clause is acting like a noun and acting as the subject of the sentence. And of course, the verbs will change. That he has no sense of direction never stops him from setting out on these long trips. that he has no sense of direction. That entire clause is the subject of the sentence, and then the verb stops. Substantive clause can also act as the direct object of the sentence. So, for example, this sentence about the 14th Amendment, which is my favorite amendment, the 14th Amendment says that all citizens have equal protection before the law. So, 14th Amendment subject says verb, and then the direct object. What is it that the amendment says? The thing that it says is this entire clause. Then we could also have, this would be a more cynical voice, I do not know where this nation is going. So again, subject, pronoun, verb, do not know, and then what is it that the speaker does not know? The direct object is that clause. So in general, when we have the idiomatic structure of a verb plus a that clause, and this is common to many different verbs, anytime this happens, what we have is a substantive clause acting as the direct object of the verb. Finally, another noun role, of course, is object of a preposition. A substantive clause can be the object of a preposition. So she doesn't care about what the doctor says. So what we have here is a preposition about, and then the object of the preposition is this entire clause. Again, we have a preposition, the preposition to, and the object of the preposition is this entire clause. So this is just an introduction to the idea of substantive clauses. This is not something you hear much in colloquial speech. This is a very sophisticated grammatical form, and you will see this on the sentence correction. So this video introduces the idea of phrases. What exactly is a phrase? Well, it's funny. The word phrase, it's actually a catch-all category. In other words, basically, any important group of words that is not a clause, we call a phrase. So if it has a full noun and verb, that makes it a clause. And if it's a grammatical structure that does not involve a full noun or a verb, it's a phrase. So there's a bunch that's included in this category of phrases. The 6 major types of phrases are listed here. These first 3 we'll explore in the next 3 videos. So these will be explored right away. The last 3, gerunds, infinitives, and participial phrases, these are verb forms, so these will be explored in the module that discusses verb forms. This video is about prepositional phrases, a very, very common grammatical form. First of all, I would estimate that of the sentences in the sentence correction module of the GMAT official guide, I would estimate over 95% of them have prepositional phrases in them. Much in the same way, if you read an article in a newspaper, an article in a magazine, almost every sentence will involve a prepositional phrase. These are very, very common. The basic form is simply a preposition plus an object. The object can be a noun or a pronoun in objective form. Now, you may remember pronouns have subjective form when they can be the subject of a sentence, or they have objective form when they're a direct object, or when they're the object of a preposition. And these would be forms like me, him, her, us, and them. Here's a list of some common prepositions. You're welcome to pause the screen and take these in. Here is a list of the 7 compound prepositions. Now, in each one of these, the 2 words together function as a single preposition. So the general form of a prepositional phrase, we have a preposition that may be either a single word preposition or a compound preposition, plus an object. The object can be, as we said above, it can be a noun or a pronoun in objective form, or it can be something taking the place of a noun. That is to say, either a gerund or a substantive clause. We've already seen some examples in the video on substantive clauses. A prepositional phrase can serve either as an adjective or an adverb. That is to say, it can be either an adjectival phrase or as an adverbial phrase. We've already seen some examples of these in the videos on adverbs and adjectives. Here's another example. This sentence is actually from Hamlet, spoken in Shakespeare's play. There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy. The first prepositional phrase actually has two objects in parallel, in heaven and earth. This tells us what kind of things. This is an adjectival phrase. than are dreamt of in your philosophy. This is telling us where it is dreamed. So this is an adverbial phrase. So here we have one sentence with both types of prepositional phrases. This video is about a sophisticated grammatical construction called the appositive phrase. An appositive phrase is a kind of noun modifier. It's very special. What we're doing is we have one noun and then we follow that immediately with another noun. This second noun is modifying the first noun, either by providing some sort of description, some sort of clarification, maybe providing a definition if someone weren't familiar with the role. So for example, my finch Raimundo, the name Raimundo is modifying the noun finch, providing the name of the finch, in case you weren't familiar with the name of my finch. In the phrase George Washington, the father of the country, George Washington is the main noun, and then we have this descriptive phrase, the appositive phrase, the father of our country, that certainly describes George Washington, and it provides information if, in case, for example, someone were unfamiliar with the role of George Washington. Now notice that one of these is set off by commas and one of them is not set off by commas. Do you use commas or not with an appositive phrase? Well, that gets into a very sophisticated issue concerning modification. That's more sophisticated than we can get into here. That's something we'll discuss much later in the videos about logical predication and modification. Now, a special case, we can have more than one appositive phrase. So, for example, the famous quote from Julius Caesar, "Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears." These are not three different groups of people. This is the same group of people identified in three different ways. So we have the noun, friends, and then we have two appositive phrases modifying that noun. So this is a relatively rare construction. This is used most often in oratory. It would be relatively unlikely to see on the GMAT, although, of course, you could see it on the GMAT. What you're more likely to see on the GMAT is something like this. Either noun number one or noun number two can be modified by phrases or clauses. So this is just an excerpt from a sentence. This is actually from the famous Hamlet soliloquy. ... But that the dread of something after death, the undiscovered country from whose border no traveler returns, puzzles the will, ... So we have the noun death, and then we have this appositive phrase. This appositive phrase, we have a noun, and then actually we have a modifying clause, modifying the noun. So something like this level of sophistication is very typical of how appositive phrases will appear on the GMAT sentence correction. This video is about another sophisticated grammatical form called an absolute phrase. An absolute phrase consists of a noun plus a participial phrase. And this absolute phrase stands outside the main clause. So it could come before the main clause, it could come after the main clause. Two very common absolute phrases you may hear in everyday speech. That being said, that's an example of an absolute phrase. We have pronoun and then a participle, or all things being equal. Again, noun and then participial phrase. Those are examples of absolute phrases. An absolute phrase stands outside the main clause and modifies the main clause as a whole. So it's not modifying a particular noun, it's modifying the clause overall. So, for example, profits having declined for 3 consecutive months, the CEO decided to lay off 600 employees. So the second part of the sentence, this is the independent clause. Here we have a noun, we have a verb. This is a full bona fide clause. This first part, this is not a clause. This is an absolute phrase. We have a noun, and then we have a participle, having declined. And that begins a participial phrase. So profits and then having declined for 3 consecutive months, that's a noun plus a participial phrase together. That's an absolute phrase. And notice that modifies the independent clause. It gives us some background information, provides us some insight into why the CEO made the decision that he made. So this is an introduction to this very sophisticated form. This form can appear on the GMAT sentence correction. In this last video, the Grammar Basics section, I'll discuss a point of strategy, namely removing fluff from sentences. What exactly do we mean by this? Well, the core of every sentence is the main subject and the main verb. You may remember from the previous videos, every sentence must have at least one independent clause, and the independent clause of a sentence, the subject and verb of that clause is the main subject and the main verb of the sentence. So every sentence needs a main subject and a main verb, and every clause, even a subordinate clause, needs its own subject and verb. So the question is, how do we find these? How do we identify these? To find the main subject and main verb, and the subject and verb of each clause, eliminate all the prepositional phrases, all the modifiers, adverbs, and adjectives, and all modifying phrases and clauses. And that will allow you to hone in on the core of each sentence and the core of each clause. This might be the single most important skill on the GMAT. In other words, if you're able to do this, you're able to see the fundamental structure of a sentence. So suppose we look at a very complicated sentence. This particular sentence happens to be the 7th Amendment of the United States Constitution. It's from the Bill of Rights. And incidentally, if you want to see very sophisticated, very complicated sentences, look at the sentences they use in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Some very sophisticated writing there. So this particular sentence, we start with some prepositional phrases. In suits at common law, prepositional phrases. Then we get to a relative adverb. So this is beginning a subordinate clause now, where the value in the controversy shall exceed $20. So that's all a subordinate clause. Now we get to the independent clause, the right. Okay, that's a noun. Then we have preposition, shall be preserved. We have a noun and a verb. There we go, a main noun and a main verb in the independent clause. Then we get to a coordinating conjunction, and. This is joining us to another independent clause. So then we get another noun, no fact. Then we get a modifier. Shall be re-examined. So we get a second noun and a second verb. Then we have some more prepositional phrases, some more modifying stuff. So what we have here is a sentence with two independent clauses. And we also have a subordinate clause. Let's go back and look at the subordinate clause. So we have the relative adverb at the beginning. Then inside this we have a noun and shall exceed. That's the verb inside the clause. So the subordinate clause has its own noun and verb, and then there are two independent clauses, each with their own noun and verb. And again, this ability to find the main noun and the main verb in each independent clause and find the noun and verb in each subordinate clause, this is a crucial ability on GMAT sentence correction.